Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first sort of inaugural opening of a trade house at a climate COP. Alternative universes, right? You know, and this one's a very big one, but I think it's a testament to the leadership on the podium that the ICC, ITC, UNCTAD and the WTO have come together because the trade agenda was nowhere near a COP agenda a few years ago, and each year it's been sort of working its way into the action agenda and working its way into sort of the peripheral vision, and now I think the central vision of what it's going to take to reform our economies so that we can both protect people and progress. By Minister Al-Thani, who will give us a keynote address. But just before I offer him the floor, the organisers have been running a little online campaign before we arrived at this meeting to try to inquire as to what stakeholders would like global leaders to prioritise when it comes to the collective action that we need on trade and climate. Now, you too can vote, and if you look up on the slide behind me, you can see that you can take a picture of that Q code, go to Slido, hashtag 3154101, and using a word cloud we can see what you think are the most important things, and then later in the session we'll show up on the screen what the results of the vote are, and then the leaders will go on their way and implement everything that you ask them to do. I think that's the way it works, I think, right? Something like that. So I've known His Excellency Dr. Thani bin Ahmed Al Zeyoudi for quite a while. He's a dynamic young minister, truly dedicated to this agenda. And sir, if we can ask you to bring your vision to the opening of this session, I'd be most grateful. Thank you very much indeed.
Again, after a while. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. A very welcome to what is a highly significant moment. For the first time ever, as my colleague Dr. Rachid said, the Conference Party is shining a spotlight on trade and its role on delivering sustainable future. And today we are opening the Trade House Pavilion, the dedicated space that will host many of the discussion on how trade can help drive sustainable development action. The Pavilion is an initiative of the COP Presidency in collaboration with WTO, ICC, ITC and UNCTAD. Its objective is simple: to leverage our collective efforts and expertise to create a greener and smarter as well as sustainable global trading system. And on Monday, it will take a center stage as we mark Trade Day at COP28, an opportunity for stakeholders to engage in a crucial discussion at crucial time for the world. Before I continue my discussion, I'd like to just share some of the personal stories. I met Her Excellency Dr. Ngozi, I think earlier this year, and I thought I'm coming up with a new idea. Let's work on bringing trade to COP28. And she was ahead of me. She was engaged with the COP presidency, and she started talking about this and said, okay, now I have to be part of this, otherwise I'm going to be out of the discussion. So credit goes to Dr. Ngozi on this. Trade is the source of much of our collective prosperity and socio-economic development, a force that has powered progress and lifted millions of people out of poverty. In the UAE, it has been the driving force behind our phenomenal growth over the last half-century, enabling our economy to increase 20-fold in that time. Due to our strategic location and our network of global trading partners, and underpinned by our world-class infrastructure, trade remains the engine of the UAE's economy and has enabled us to become essential interport connecting East and West. As our comprehensive economic partnership agreement program successfully expands, so to do our trade relations with strategic partners around the world, enabling us to achieve potential exponential growth in our non-oil trade and diversify our economy across a wide range of sectors and industry. We recognize the power of trade to drive progress, And that's why we're committed to making sure it remains open, inclusive, and sustainable global trade ecosystem where all can thrive. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as I have said repeatedly, you cannot discuss sustainability and climate action without discussing trade, a sector now worth more than $25 trillion to the global economy. But while the benefits that trade has brought to the world cannot be overstated, neither can we ignore the role it must now play in combating climate change. The Trade Pavilion will allow us to focus on adapting trade to help us achieve our shared climate action. And to interest bold new ideas that will fast-track the spread of a smarter global trading system and a greener supply chains. Ideas that will create new sustainable industries, unleash breakthrough climate innovation, empower our SMEs to scale up their activities, and facilitate investment for new climate-friendly projects and joint ventures. And all supported by an equitable, modern trading system that will enable those ideas to flourish globally. The COP28 Trade Day will feature many of the panel sessions led by experts from around the world. They will discuss how to leverage trade policy to decarbonize supply chain, incentivize SMEs to invest in a net zero future, build the green skills capacity, accelerate energy transition, integrate sustainability into trade finance, and adopt technologies to increase efficiency in trade. So let us use this opportunity to discuss how we can upgrade the global trading system and enhance its contribution to our climate ambitions. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's our collective action this week that will help to charter a more beneficial course for the planet. I'm very confident that our collective ambitions will help us deliver on the shared commitments we made in Paris in 2015. This is an opportunity to work in illusion of to make the first trade day a catalyst for positive change. I wish you all a very productive and beneficial COP28. Thank you so much for hosting us.
Thank you very much. So the focus of this discussion, this incredible array of leaders, is going to be on what the priorities are and how each institution can drive the agenda forward. We're going to need a lot of cooperation across the trade sphere and then between the trade sphere and the climate sphere to move forward. And then what are the practical examples of how that work can take place? And I think I'm punting here because we're waiting for the results. It's coming? Or, if not, I'll get Pamela to sing. She offered earlier. Yeah, Rebecca can dance as well, so we can have a whole party. Oh, here we go. Okay. So right at the heart of that is inclusiveness, which I think is really important, because in many of the business sessions I've been sitting in earlier today, it's like, how do you regulate business and support business to invest now, not in 10 years' time? We've got to reduce emissions by 45% before 2030. And that's where the inclusiveness as well as the emissions reduction is going to have to come from. So how do you help government regulate effectively for that, and how do you help business deliver that? Trade must be at the heart of all of that. So we'll leave that up there, and I'm going to go first to, she needs no introduction, the head of the WTO, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. You've been really pushing, I think, at this agenda now from your position at WTO over the last couple of years. Huge global organization, really helping it focus on what it can do in partnership. And I know that you've launched trade policy options for climate action today, really interesting principles. Can you talk a little bit about where you see the opportunities for the WTO to sort of drive the agenda and to also open up what needs to be done?
Well, thank you very much, Rachel. First, thanks for accepting to do this. And I just want to say a strong thank you to the Minister and all my colleagues, from John to Rebecca to Pamela, for joining us here today. This is what international cooperation is all about, and I'll come back to that. You said it, Rachel. Trade has a really big impact on people's lives. The minister mentioned $25 trillion in goods trade. You add on top of that another $7 trillion in services trade. And you can see $32 trillion in global trade. This is a huge number that, I'm saying these numbers so people can get their heads around. And what the WTO has been able to do is to put in place the rules that underpin this enormous trade in the world so that they can be fair, predictable, stable, and people can trade knowing that they have a sound and fair basis to do that. And with all the discussions about deglobalization, I just want people to know that 75% of world trade still happens on WTO terms. Those tariff terms that have been agreed at the institution. So when we look at this kind of power, I want to give you one more thing. 1 in 5 calories consumed in the world is traded. I was saying that to the head of a civil society organization I ran into, who works on food, and she was surprised. She hadn't thought about it. With all that, we must ask ourselves, how can trade work for a net zero transition? How do we get away from the narrative that trade is part of the problem? Yes, it is. Of course, the logistics of trade, we know shipping, aviation, they contribute to carbon emissions. But there's so many other things in terms of the solutions that cannot happen without trade. And that's why we began this work of trying to put trade at the center, to change the narrative, to get people to see trade has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty. So how can trade contribute? And so, like you said, we put our minds to it. First, we thought cooperation is key. So we have to work with our sisters. The three sisters are here. I don't mean to make you feel strange, John and Mr. Minister. You have a solidarity, but we've been working closely together on many of these things.
That's why we put them there.
And at last COP, we worked closely with UNCTAD and ITC to try to see. We did a World Trade Report on trade and climate, and the next step is, how do we get specific about what countries can do to bring solutions into their nationally determined contributions? And that's what led us to this, which we launched, Trade Policy Tools for Climate. And it contains 10 measures that governments need to think about if they want to make trade part of the solution. I'll just give you 2 very quickly. We'll come back to it. One of them, let me start with one. We have a government procurement agreement. How many people know just how much government procurement is? And what's the sum? 13 trillion, good. We have a very educated audience. Can you imagine if the $13 trillion, you're able to use it as a tool to force green procurement? And that is one of the things we are saying. We are custodians of this agreement, and we're telling our members, you have to use this differently. Some of them are already doing it, as I'm sure you hear from Rebecca, but how can we spread this? Just one more example, then I'll shut up. Another one that I'm very keen, when I was in cabinet as a finance minister, and customs reported to me, I looked, being a buff for the climate transition and all that, and I saw that we had policies, customs tariffs that favored brown goods. So we had lower tariffs on second-hand cars and on fossil fuel goods than on electric or hybrid vehicles. And you don't really think about it. So that's one of the things we're saying to many countries, especially developing countries. Could you please look at your import tariff regime to make sure you don't have disincentives against renewables, against products that can help you towards zero transition. So these are some, it's not rocket science, but if you do it, it can really be enormously helpful. Let me stop it.
Oh, so thank you very much. And obviously there was a career-enhancing movement there, so somebody's due for a promotion, so that was great. But I think the point that you're making, Ngozi, is so important, because this narrative that trade's the problem is also a narrative that gets sort of hooked onto a north-south divide, which is a blunt instrument in really discussing how we're going to help everybody move forward. So to come to Rebecca, UNCTAD, a misunderstood but very powerful part of the original UN, Bretton Woods institutions, actually a very powerful part of the international architecture, because it's a permanent body. And we can answer diplomatic questions on what that means over drinks later. But, I mean, Rebecca, you've really focused UNCTAD in the last few years on, so what does this mean for developing countries in particular, in emerging markets? How do they take the trade agenda and make it work for them in this extraordinary challenge of managing the transition? So how does cooperation help you? What can you contribute?
Okay, first of all, thank you so much, and thank you, Tani, thank you, Minister, for having us here. We were just a few weeks ago in Abu Dhabi in our World Investment Forum, and it was also fantastic. So really, UAE is everywhere, you know. Thank you very much. And so glad to be here with John, with Ngozi, with Pamela, and obviously with Rachel. Thank you for bringing us together, you know, and this trade house for being together. I think that is a great thing that we cooperate, and we also show that we are cooperating because sometimes we cooperate and nobody knows, you know. So we have to change the narrative, yes. And let's think only about what is happening today in the global growth, yes. Global growth is not great. Yes, it's really slowing down. Each year we have less growth than last year for 4 years in a row. Yeah, so we are not in a dynamic economy right now. Yeah. Two things that are important for the developing countries are weak. One is investment, not only because investment is weak for everybody. Since the crisis of 2008, investment never recovered fully. But also because most of the investment is going to the developed countries, not to the developing countries. Yeah? So the inclusiveness word in there is very important. Yeah? And the other is that trade is not growing more than GDP. It's growing less than GDP. So trade is not today the engine of growth that it was, you know, some years ago, before the pandemic and before this period. And developing countries need investment and trade. So when you think what are the engines of growth that we can think about for the future, it will have trade and investment for the climate agenda. It will have to be for the transition, yes? And if we really want, they liked it. So if we really want, you know, a sustainable growth, we will have to think about trade and investment for the transition, for the green revolution, for sustainable development. Yeah. So we have to change the narrative in trade and in investment too, you know, that it will have to really help for an inclusive, sustainable development narrative that we have to embrace. Now, what are the obstacles that we have to overcome for that narrative? And I think that Rachel and Ngozi were talking about it. The first thing is that this is not agenda of a new protectionist agenda against developing countries. And let's be fair, it doesn't have to be, because it can be well designed, but we have seen worrying signs in some places. So let's be aware that we have to fight against any protectionist agenda that wants to co-opt the very positive and constructive climate agenda that we want to build. My second point is that we have to avoid the spaghetti ball. Yes? And that's something, Ngozi, that you have been very clear on. You know, the spaghetti ball is terrible. We have more than 80, I think, 73 rules and regulations with respect to environment, believe me, developing countries are really struggling. And SMEs are struggling even more because they cannot navigate such a complicated system. So let's do something about it. If we are going to have an agenda, let's have a coherent agenda that is multilateral and that doesn't have the spaghetti ball that really affects developing countries. And the third point is that developing countries need the world to, really be serious about taking them into account. If we continue to discuss issues in forums that are not universal, that are not multilateral, and try to impose that agenda on others, we will have trouble. Because then the developing countries won't be part of the solution. They will be defensive and not constructive, for good reasons, not for bad reasons. So I think that UNCTAD can really help in all of these three issues because we have policy that is evidence-based, that can see the problems from the developing countries' perspective, but to construct a universal agenda that is inclusive and that is, yielding towards a sustainable development, future. So that is, I think that UNCTAD can be really contribute to it. We will have another question on what UNCTAD is doing, I hope.
Yes.
And I will go there when the question will come. Thank you.
Very good. So in this, I think that a very key point, right? It's a distracted and fragmented world, and so this trade cooperation that you see here is fundamentally important. So you've got WTO and an UNCTAD, and their beautiful child is the ITC. Look what they've produced. So Pamela Coke-Hamilton leads the ITC now, which is dedicated on SMEs, particularly in the developing world. So we've heard how difficult it is for them. So how do you come into this cooperation? Why is the cooperation so important for you?
Thanks so much, Rachel. It's great to see you again. And I just want to thank my fellow heads of agencies, my parents, for their continued support and, leadership. And thanks. Trust me, children never leave, right? And thanks, John and Minister. Thank you so much for this. I think where I want to start off is, what is really critical for us as ITC is to focus in on the issues that affect small and medium-sized enterprises. So our role here, as we see it, is to amplify the voice of the small business. And you talked about inclusiveness. The main issue of that is the very issue that we're looking at here. That when we went to COP26, and we walked the entire length of the Glasgow, it was 3 blocks. There was not one SME represented in terms of what they needed, what their voice was, etc. So we thought, okay, let's see how we can try to bring in the voice of the capacity of MSMEs. Last year we brought 5. This year we've brought 5 SMEs plus the BSOs that support them. One of the main issues that we found are how do we work directly with them to translate trade? And this is the big issue. Everybody talks at high level, and it's great. It's great to talk about the issues of climate and trade. It's great to look at what the details are because those are critical. It's great to look at the rules and how those can be used in protectionist or non-protectionist ways. But at the end of the day, who are the ones impacted? The small businesses. Who are the ones who have to implement the rules? The businesses. And so what we try to do is several things. We work at the level of capacity building. So we work with businesses to do climate smart agriculture. We've been doing that in Iraq, in Newana and Basra. We've worked with cooperatives to help them actually redo their fields in a way that enhances their waste management, water management, all of that. We then also work at the level of financing. One of the things that I think is really important is to recognize that the issue of financing is not so much a problem of money, but a problem of the ability to get that money. And one of the big challenges is how do we help prepare these SMEs to actually be able to access those funds? Because there are pockets of funds all over the place. The issue is many of the SMEs are not in a position because they don't have the paperwork properly, because they don't have the proper collateral, because banks won't allow them and then they're very risk averse. So working in that finance space to actually bring the matching funds. And the third and final area is how do we actually enable them to do this just transition? And if we look at the concept of just transition, then we're looking at the concept, in my view, of justice. I mean, it seems obvious, but it's not necessarily so obvious. That the just transition must take into account the fact that there are unequals in the room, that there is no one size fits all, and that we have to have tailored approaches looking at the issues of indigenous people, of women, of youth, and all the various pockets of different levels that we have to address, and to take that into account in any just transition dialogue. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So from ITC to the ICC, 45 million businesses worldwide. What would you like to see, John Denton, from government-business collaboration? It seems to me that in a number of countries, the space for continued dialogue between business and government is actually becoming more and more constricted. But what would you like to see in that dialogue, specifically on trade and climate?
Wow, first, as I'm neither a brother or a sister of the WTO or UNCTAD, maybe I'm the adopted kind of child that was always troubled and you never quite knew how to deal with, which is probably a good way of describing the private sector and engagement with multilateral organizations. Minister, thank you very much for hosting us. We had a wonderful catch-up at the ASEAN meeting as well, and we're really looking forward to MC13 and Abu Dhabi. It's like everything's happening in UAE around these important issues. If I could, just a couple of points on inclusiveness, because I think this is a really important issue for the ICC. Since I became Secretary General of the ICC, one thing I noticed was this emerging gap in trust. And I looked at the ICC from our heritage. We were principally, like most international organizations in a way, dominated by, or DNA built on advanced economies and I suppose the globalizing North. And it struck me that to be relevant for the ICC in the 21st century, we had to shift that dynamic. And so what I've been emphasizing is now the platform of the ICC, which has expanded to cover now a constituency which involves 170 countries, almost 70% of which are in the global south. Now I say that deliberately because what is really important is, I saw the word flash up there, is inclusiveness. We are actually the most inclusive business voice in the world, because I think that's really important in terms of the legitimacy which we seek to engage in the public policy discussions which are relevant. Something that we have really focused on at ICC. I can give you some other beautiful numbers, but I'll hold them back up because I'll hold them till later, because it's quite useful to see the impact we have in trade. Looking at this issue of trade and climate, and by the way, I actually think leadership really matters here. And I raised, by the way, Dr. Ngozi, the issue of government procurement. Please, I'm going to keep you awake, don't worry. I raised this issue of government procurement and the need to align it with climate alignment 4 years ago when I became Secretary General of the ICC, and I raised it with your predecessor. And I don't say this to be critical, but just to point out that it's only under your leadership that the opportunity to look at procurement and align it is actually coming to the fore. Leadership does matter. And I think, obviously, Rebecca and I worked very closely on the UN Secretary General's Global Crisis Response Group, where we both worked on food, and now we're working on another challenging issue, which is debt and liquidity. But again, leadership does matter. The way in which UNCTAD now is seen, particularly by, I think, the private sector, as a partner would not have happened without your leadership. And Pamela, Pamela and the ICC, we work on practical stuff with SMEs. I mean, we work together. We've created 14 centers of entrepreneurship globally because one of the aims here is to enable people in developing and emerging economies to actually have the skills to participate in market-based economies because they, you know what, they might actually support the maintenance of market-based economies. So we're trying to scale that on a global basis. So leadership does matter. And I think the leadership that I see here comes from a very trite observation that for 30 years, there has never been a trade and climate discussion of a formal sense at the COP process. We have all determined to change that. And for me, the issue really is, when I look at the ambition of UAE as leader, around ambition and action, when I look at trade and climate, I look at it in that context as well. There are plenty of discussions that will take place behind closed doors about Article 6 and on we go. And of course, to be honest with you, from my experience, a lot of those discussions will get lost because the end users, the people who actually propel the access to the finance, the private sector will not be in those rooms. So solutions will be emerging in frameworks which often will be unworkable, lacking sequence, failing to understand what practically needs to happen. So my view on all that is that let that happen. I'm actually working on developing and strengthening the private market for carbon, by the way. In fact, one of the announceables that will be hopefully coming through is just how do we get functioning carbon registers operating. And by the way, the best opportunity for that will be at CARICOM economies because they have an interest, they have a dynamism to act, etc. So how do you act? So we look at this and say, look at trade and climate. How can the combination of the two advance our ambition on climate? What's in the way in terms of regulatory divergences that stop it happen? If we want to make it happen, how do we minimize the frictions that are there because of the misalignment of the system? And so what do we need to get done? So we're looking at, and the classic case study for me, which we've been working on, and we'll have an announceable on this on Trade Day on the 4th of December, and we congratulate the Presidency for actually enabling this to happen, is around the circular economy. I mean, this is not something which is theoretical 5 years out. We've got to realign to enable that to happen.
How do we promote green exports? What's your talking to them about what's getting in the way? You can design stuff from the top down that is never going to work. And I think there's sort of the need for converse. How are you going to inform us in that?
Well, I think that we have been working several aspects, but also finance and in the economy. If the finance is not right, then we won't move on the things that we need to do. Yeah, and that goes to investment, and that goes to government finance to do the transition. Yes, so and let's be clear, climate finance has to be a very important part of the discussion. It is here, and is that what have we done on investment and trade? So one of the things that we have done is we have taken 60 NDCs programs, 60 countries, LDCs and landlocked, and all types of developing strategies with respect to trade and investment. The word trade doesn't even appears almost in the NDCs. So the people went back to the NDCs and said, well, but are there, strategies here that have to do with trade? And so they found 600, actions that have to do with trade, but without any knowledge of how to do it through trade. It was just the objectives needed trade to be accomplished, but trade was not part of the measures or of the objectives. And obviously this is so because trade ministers have not been consulted on the NDCs. This is what happens also in the governments. Yes, there are the ministers of environment do the NDCs, but not necessarily the minister of trade are of the trade policies that were related to the objectives from the NDCs that were related to trade in an invisible way. So to help countries look at the NDCs, they will have to revise the NDCs next year. Yes, trade and in a way give the instruments to the decision makers to look at the taxonomy, to look at the relationship between what they want. One thing that we have done. Let me give you only 2 headlines, because she's looking at me with the look we know from Rachel. So let me just mention 2 other things in which we are very much involved. One is the decarbonization of the maritime transport. We have several documents on it, so I won't go into it, but it's a very important one. Remember, maritime transport is 80% of the trade goes through the maritime road. So 80%, so it's a very important agenda. And the third one is the whole issue of plastics and the blue economy. That has to do with the fishery communities, but also has to do with the effects of plastic on climate change, not only on pollution of the oceans. So I just want to read the externalities that comes from plastic and no circular economy. Yes? So the annual cost of plastic pollution is $2.2 trillion. 1.5 trillion in ocean damage, 695 billion on greenhouse emissions, and 25 billion in land pollution. So what we can save, talking about financing, what we can save from a real plastic action with respect to pollution, with respect to climate change, with respect to the economy of the ocean is so important that we have to take this seriously, and we are. Thank you.
Thank you. You've given me real cause for thought there. I'll come back in the conclusion, but in the end of every one of those supply chains are thousands and thousands of SMEs. So I know that at this COP, Pamela, you've produced a green performance toolkit for SMEs. How do you see, what will be the impact of that? What do you hope will be the impact? And how do you think that helps get the SME voice more into, everybody's somebody's scope 1 emission, right? I mean, everybody's somebody in somebody's scope 3 rather. How do you really help them drive action from the bottom up, as it were?
Well, before I get to the Green Performance Toolkit, I think one of the things that I wanted to say is that it's part of a suite of other, in a way, goods that have started, public goods that we started with. For example, the Green to Compete hubs that we've set up around the world are basically aimed at helping those BSOs help businesses themselves become green. And we made the business case for going green for many of the companies, because the first thing was resistance. Why was there resistance? Because for most people, going green is a cost for most businesses. So we had to flip the switch, in a sense, as you said, change the narrative. Why do you want to go green? 1, you lower your costs. 2, you increase your productivity. 3, you're able to access organic markets and new market spaces that only want a certain type of product. 4, they were able to increase their circularity and their ability to save the environment. So what we were able to do was convince them as to why this was important. We then had the Climate Competitiveness Assessment tool, which looks overall at how competitive can they be in the context of a changing climate. Added to that, last year we launched the Climate Smart Network, which has over 60,000 businesses who form part of a supply chain where bigger businesses can actually source from these businesses who are already certified as being green. And therefore it makes it easier for those who now have to face certain compliance measures to prove that they are actually sourcing from green businesses. So this tool is a new one which actually looks at creating a baseline and benchmarking. It allows companies to look at a suite of 8 different areas. So for example, environment management systems, energy, looking at waste, water and wastewater. It looks also at air emissions, looks at global greenhouse gases, and then finally on chemicals and soil. And what it does is it allows businesses to go and do a self-assessment of where exactly they are in meeting these particular standards, these particular goals. It allows them to do ESG reporting. It enables them to have a set of baseline data to go to banks and say, look, this is what we need to do. This is what we'd like to do. How do we tailor the response? So that's one of the reasons why we want to launch this toolkit as a baseline measure. It also enables us to look at the issue of financing and what kind of financing will be needed over the period for them to get this kind of access. I do want to tell you one short story. There's a woman in Kenya that we've worked with. Her name is Yvonne Otieno. And she runs a place that is an agro-processing business called Miongo, fresh greens, yeah. She has been able to follow through this process. And one of the things that she's been able to do is to work on getting her certification, because the standard certification, as you know, is a huge, and Rebecca alluded to this earlier about certain standards. There are over 300 voluntary sustainability standards. And we know every business has to try to meet one of those. How do we look at harmonizing that? How do we look at the issue of what everybody talks about now in terms of certain protectionist policies? I shouldn't say they're protectionist policies. They're legitimate policies which are having a protectionist impact. And how do we address that conundrum? And these are some of the ways that we're working with small business and with governments to address those particular killing trade. Thanks.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, the unintended as well as the intended consequences of a lot of the rulemaking is something that we're going to have to grapple with more and more. So Ngozi, in your hands is a very exciting, I don't actually want to sound too nerdy about this, but I am very UAE. This is real news. So over to you.
Well, you've made it sound really thrilling.
It is.
Oh, sorry. I said Rachel made steel sound very thrilling. But it is true that in addition to the booklet I showed you before with these measures that can be worked into NDCs, the other thing we've been doing at the WTO, advertently or inadvertently, but we were approached by the steel industry with the fact that they are facing so many, fragmented, and they wanted us to see if there was anything that we could do to help them do that. And I want to give credit to Jean-Marie Palgam and the team right here, because he worked really hard. Jean-Marie, Violetta, where is Ho? I think that you know that when we do work, it's really people also working behind to make it happen. But our team worked really hard with the industry to try to see how could we come with harmonized approaches. Look, there's one common theme you hear from all of us, and that is that as we try to get to net zero, our approaches are fragmented. And that is very difficult for small businesses, difficult for big businesses, even difficult sometimes for governments. Developing country governments have great difficulty seeing what is happening elsewhere. So there's a common theme of harmonization, cooperation, and that's what we brought to this by working with other stakeholders to say, how can we enunciate principles that can help us to help the steel industry decarbonize. And we launched that today. And Rachel made it sound very sexy. It is actually. Because if we succeed with this, then we can apply it to some other sectors. And I think John should be clapping heartily. So that's the second thing we've done here that I am really proud of today. And let me end by telling you just one more quick thing that we're doing. Still on the issue of fragmentation, we believe that the multiple approaches to carbon pricing, carbon market, again, I think international organizations can take action. And I'm happy to say that at the recent meeting in Marrakesh of finance ministers, the issue came up. And the IMF is working on it, the World Bank is working on it, the WTO, the OECD, the International Maritime Organization, all with slightly different approaches when this discussion came up, I put up my hand with the finance ministers. I used to be one of their colleagues, like Rebecca, so they still listen to what we have to say. And I said, why don't we form a task force of international organizations to try to come up with a common methodological approach for countries, because this is too difficult for developing countries to follow. And that was adopted. I'm happy to tell you the task force is on. We've got the IMF, World Bank, all of us are part of it. And we hope that will help developing countries, help business, help micro, medium, and small enterprises. So for us, this is very exciting here to see trade being right in the middle of the biggest problems we're struggling with. Thank you.
That's excellent, and excellent news from Marrakesh that that's already underway. So, John, to you, you've been working on principles for sustainable trade as well from the business perspective. What do you hope that will achieve?
Oh, thanks very much. And by the way, just a huge shout out on this issue of creating an integrated approach from all the IOs on the subject we're discussing. And this is something we've also been calling for, because it's just the complexity of divergence. I mean, we've just done a big piece, which we'll be talking about again on Trade Day, about best practice in actual carbon markets, etc. There's just so much stuff that can be done. But going to the specific issue of trade finance, again, this falls into the, I suppose, under the rubric for me of ambition and action. I did promise you some numbers before, so there's a small anecdote at the end of this, but the ICC actually curates through our instruments $10 trillion worth of trade finance. And when you add on to that what we curate through the operation of Incoterms, which we actually look after, maintain, re-energize, certificates of origin, on we go, we're actually responsible for enabling $17.5 trillion worth of trade. Which, by the way, is 75% of global trade. So we have an obligation. But I did point out, I had the honor of meeting Premier Li in Beijing a couple of days ago, and I did cheekily say to him, of course, you realize 17.5 trillion, that's kind of like the Chinese GDP. And so he looked at me again in quite a different way, I might say. But so the reason I say this is we have ambition here, but because we are responsible for curating, particularly trade finance, one of our actions is, well, let's not talk about it, let's do what we can with what we've got. So 2 COPs ago, I announced that we would be ambitious and we would seek to bring the whole of trade finance as an asset class into alignment with Paris. But of course, saying that and doing it is more complex. This is a complicated asset class. But what we've been able to do over the last, by the time we got to the last COP, was actually make real progress. We're doing it in what's called waves. I'm an Australian, so I'm always very attracted to the idea of diving into waves. And we started by bringing in, we're now working with 80 of the world's largest banks who are involved in curating basically trade finance by using ICC tools and working with the various sectors. And we've divided it up into various sectors. And this is complicated because we're actually trying to grade things to give guidance here, but also if we can move to a grading system that provides a positive green or a tick or an ICC tick, or there should be access to advantages in financing, for example. So that's what we're trying to create here, which will be very facilitative to SMEs in alignment. But it's just hard work. But the reality is this COP, and again on 4 December, we'll be announcing the next wave, which will look at textiles, agriculture, and we've been doing the preliminary work on that. Our ambitious aim is to align the $10 trillion worth of trade finance with Paris. And we're actually taking action. We are not waiting for the G20 finance ministers. We are not waiting to be told what to do, because if we were, then we would never have got started.
Thank you very much. So you bring us to the top of the hour. And I just want to, in conclusion, just building off this incredible panel, just sort of really center this debate for you over the next 10 days of this COP. Coming in with the stock take in hand, it's easy to sort of say, okay, Paris is failing, right? We're not on track. And on-trackedness is something that's being discussed in all of these pavilions. But the truth of the matter is that Paris is not failing, but we started too late and we're not going fast enough. So if we're going to catch up, the trade debate has to be at the very center of the way in which we get the efficiency and the inclusivity from the word cloud into the economic progress that we need for everybody. And so it's right that at COP28 we have a trade house right at the centre of the discussion. At the same time, we need to spur much more positive trade and investment, because the winds of change that are coming at, in particular, emerging markets and developing economies, they're cold and they're fierce, right? And so we need to act now. And what you've heard here is this array of now practical approaches from the SME up, from the coordination that's necessary in a world where we've got different taxonomies coming in different parts of the world that are all slightly different, and then the multiple approaches to carbon markets, and the fact that governments have kind of dropped the ball on some of the really fundamental pieces, and there's only so much you can do in the voluntary space. And when you think about these steel principles as an example, so these will link immediately up with extraordinary work that's going on around transition pathways. The transition pathway for a steel company is fundamentally different than the transmission pathway for a grocer or from a high-tech company. But they've all got to move at transition, and they've all got to move faster. And we've spent a lot of time setting targets, right, in recent years. And we know we've got to be at net zero at a certain point in the mid-century. And we know we've got to have 45% of emissions out by 2030. But if you're running a business, you don't get there overnight. And that target can't be a purity test. So how do you help in a low-trust environment build pathways for companies to the growth of your own economy? This is where this debate is, and it is central to the success, and I hope central to the way in which the UAE presidency brings political language to bear that sort of sends every government away from COP28 with their sleeves already rolled up, with some very, very hard work to be done across government, right, with trade ministers at the table. I'm doing some academic work on how do you help governments govern in the climate crisis? You know, do you have a cabinet committee? Do you have a delivery unit? Nobody really has got it right yet. And so these are the important questions that are thrown up. But we wouldn't be here where we are today at COP28 without extraordinary leadership. John from ICC, but the Shakespearean troika here of extraordinary women. And this is an important agenda. It's had to creep its way into the heart of a climate discussion. The climate world needs to meet it halfway, and we have to have a positive discussion about how trade has to transform economies so that they work for everybody and that they work for the planet. Please thank the panel. Now, at COP lunch, except that there is, when it comes to the trade